Lesson 13. We'll be looking at all sorts of stuff about pronouns today, but also starting with two termination adjectives. And then relative pronouns, other pronouns, reflexive pronouns, the definite article as pronoun. All right, two termination adjectives. We have already encountered first, second declension or 2-1-2 adjectives like ça passe. These are adjectives that have different forms for all three genders. The masculine forms will be declined like a second declension noun. The feminine forms will be declined like a first declension noun. The neuter forms like another second declension noun. In Greek, though, there is also a class of two termination adjectives that have the same set of endings for both masculine and feminine nouns. So this would effectively be a 2-2 adjective, removing the one for the feminine. Or alternatively, if you want to think of it this way, 2-2-2. Such adjectives tend to be compound adjectives. For example, very common, we have the alpha privative, which is just alpha, or if what it is a compound with begins with a vowel or diphthong, un, with the new added, plus a normal adjective. For instance, we have a normal adjective like aitios, aitia, aition, guilty or responsible, the cause of something. If we add our alpha privative to that, which would be in this case un, we're going to get an aitios, which will mean not guilty, not responsible. But if you'll notice, there is no unique feminine ending listed there. So you're not going to see anaitios, anaitia, anaition. It's just anaitios, anaition. There's one set of endings for masculine and feminine. They'll be the same. And there is another set of endings for the neuter. You will not see any of those etas and alphas that we associate with first declension feminine endings in the declension of these two termination adjectives. A relative pronoun, we're going to turn to pronouns now. A relative pronoun relates to a noun or other pronoun in the immediate context. So this is very abstract. We'll see some actual examples. It will be clearer. For instance, there is not a life that does not have ills. This sounds a little clumsy in English. It's a very literal translation of a sentence we'll see in Greek later on, which is why I'm going with it. There is not a life that does not have ills. Now, this is the relative pronoun, the that. We translate, we indicate relative pronouns with the word that or which or whom, in some cases even as what. But in this case, it's that. That noun or other pronoun that this relative pronoun is referring back to is called its antecedent. So what this relative pronoun is referring back to is called the antecedent. In this case, it's life. There is not a life that we are describing or qualifying in what we're saying next, this life that we just mentioned. The clause begun by the relative pronoun is called a relative clause. So beginning with our relative pronoun that and going to the end, really, of this clause is our relative clause. So we have, again, antecedent, relative pronoun, and then relative clause. And the relative clause has its own grammar. Note that in our main clause, there is not a life. That's basically our main clause here. We have a verb, finite verb, there is. It's our main verb. And then we have this clause, and it is dependent on the main clause. It wouldn't have any meaning on its own. You wouldn't just say, that does not have ills. You'd be missing something. But it does have its own grammar. In fact, we have the finite verb does or does not. So like many other kinds of dependent clauses, relative clauses have their own grammar in Greek as well as in English. In English, a relative pronoun is declined according to the following. So we'll get to learn something about relative pronouns We know a lot intuitively, of course, but there are some nuances here. So we decline a relative pronoun in English according to, first of all, whether its antecedent is a person or a thing, and second, what its function is in the relative clause. Another way of describing its function, of course, is case. And in English, we have the three cases, as we've discussed. We have the subjective, the objective, and the possessive, whereas we have the 5 cases in Greek. So if we were to look at all the different possibilities, the permutations of the English relative pronoun, this is what we'd get. So if we're talking about people, in the subjective case, we're going to see who. In the objective case, we're going to see whom. In the possessive case, we're going to see whose. And for things, we're going to use which or that for both a subjective and objective, and then whose, just as with people. The which or that depends on whether this is a restricted or non-restrictive, restrictive or non-restrictive clause, I believe are the terms. We're not going to get into that, and Greek actually doesn't do anything with that distinction, and neither, as we may one day see, does German. So in Greek, a relative pronoun is like any other pronoun in that it is declined according to case, number, and gender. So in Greek, pronouns, nouns, adjectives all have to be declined according to case, number, and gender, not according to the criteria that we use in declining our relative pronouns. With only a few exceptions, the declension of the relative pronoun is exactly the same as that of the definite article. So this is good news for us. We're not actually having to learn much that's new in the way of morphology accidents at all. So here is the declension, full declension of the definite article, ha, he, ta, the masculine, feminine, neuter forms of the definite article in singular and plural. Now we're going to see a couple changes here. The first change is we drop the tau of anytime we find it. So we drop all of those taus, and those taus occur in everything but the masculine, feminine nominative. And this is what we're left with. And the next thing we have to do, because we know that no, actually the next thing we're going to do is add something. We just drop something, we're going to add something, and that's the letter sigma to the masculine singular nominative, which leaves us so far with this. And then, because all of these forms now begin with vowels or diphthongs, we need to give them breathing marks. And these breathing marks are all going to be rough breathing. So we're basically going to be adding a h sound to the beginnings of all of these. And we do that in Greek with the rough breathing. And finally, because what we're missing, well, I wouldn't say we're missing at this point, but one thing we still need to do is, looking at these masculine and feminine nominative forms, we're going to add accents to them. If we didn't add accents like this, the feminine nominative singular and the masculine and feminine nominative plural would look exactly like the definite article forms. But by adding the accent, we help distinguish. So actually all of these forms, each and every one of these forms, is different from the corresponding form of the definite article, but the changes are very minimal. Again, we drop the tau, we add the sigma in the nominative masculine singular, we give rough breathing marks as necessary, and then we add accents where they do not already exist. And that gives us has, he, ha, who or whom, which, or that. Now, a relative pronoun gets its number and gender from its antecedent. So we're going to talk about how we actually decide on which of those forms to use. So this is the Greek translation, or I should say, this is the Greek sentence of which that English sentence was the translation. Uk este bios has uk eke kaka. So there is not a life that does not have ills. And we'll look more carefully at the grammar of this in just a second. So we know a relative pronoun. Hopefully, even at this point, we can spot it. Has It looks just like the nominative masculine singular form of the definite article with that sigma added. It's unambiguously this relative pronoun. And we know our antecedent is right before it. Usually the antecedent will be right before it, just as in English. And we're going to get the number and the gender of our relative pronoun here from the antecedent. And the antecedent is singular masculine. So we're going to tuck that away in the back of our mind because we still need to get the case. And the case we get from the function of the relative pronoun in the relative clause. So this is the relative clause, of course, the part of the sentence that starts with the relative pronoun and basically extends to the full grammar, really, the full statement that we're making. And we get the case of the relative pronoun from its function in this relative clause. And its function, we want to say, that does not have ills. So here the that is the subject of our relative clause. So we need this to be the nominative. So nominative we get from the function of the relative pronoun in the relative clause. Number and gender, singular masculine in this case, from the antecedent. And so this is going to be nominative singular masculine. And that's how we arrive at this particular form. As in English, the Greek relative pronoun can follow a preposition, after which will always be translated as which or whom. Here, this after which, of course, is an instance of this very phenomenon in English. So these are nuances of relative pronouns, and we'll actually look at an example of this. So he kora, we're talking about the land, and then we have a preposition, en, which always takes the dative, followed by a form of the relative pronoun, he kora and he. So if we were to ask ourselves how we arrive at this form of the relative pronoun, first of all, we get our number and gender from our antecedent, which is kora, not en, obviously. So feminine singular. And then we get our case from the function this has in the relative clause. Now, we don't know what the relative clause is. We're not given it. But this preposition has to take an object in the dative case. So we actually don't need to know the rest of the relative clause in order to identify the function the relative pronoun has here. So this is something like the land in which. He kora, the land, en he, in which. It's actually pretty close to how we do things in English. Greek, however, sometimes omits the antecedent. For instance, this is usually with when the antecedent is a pronoun. So akue, this is the imperative, listen to or hear. Akue ha lega. Akue ha lega. What we're saying here is listen to, literally listen to which I say. Listen to which I say. What we've done is we've dropped the that, basically, from the Greek. And we do this too in English, because we don't often say things like listen to that which I say. Instead, we say I listen to what I say. But the point is, in Greek especially, this was very clear. We are missing the that, but it's still understandable even without it. So we're often going to see relative pronouns without apparent antecedents. And usually the meaning of what we're talking about is going to be clear. We can look at this ha, and see that it is neuter singular. So we're talking about a what. And we also see the lega, the I say. So we know that this relative pronoun has to be functioning as a direct object. So listen to that. I in which is implied which I say, or listen to what I say. This may seem a little confusing at first, but eventually will become very recognizable to us. One last nuance. Finally, when the antecedent is in the genitive or dative case, the case of the relative pronoun sometimes changes to match it. This is called attraction. This is a very interesting phenomenon. So let's take another example. Pisteo haleges. Pisteo means I believe. And haleges, we're talking about you are saying something. And we might translate this as which. We can see that it's neuter plural. So we're talking about those things which. I believe those things which you say or are saying. I believe those things which you say. Now, what have we left out? What have we omitted? We've omitted the antecedent. Of course, we wouldn't say I believe those things which you say in English. We would say I believe what you say. So we see the same sort of translation in English. What is dropped out is an antecedent that would have been in the neuter dative plural. We know neuter plural just by looking at the relative pronoun there. It tells us neuter plural has to be same gender and number as our antecedent, so we can really deduce that. And we know that's in the dative because if we know anything about the verb pisteo, it takes an object in the dative of whom you believe or what you believe. So in this case, our antecedent would have been neuter dative plural. And in a case like this, the case of our relative pronoun, rather than really reflecting its true function in the relative clause, here the object, the things that you are saying, the case is going to be attracted to the case of, in this case, the omitted antecedent. So it is actually going to change to dative neuter plural. So not pisteo haleges, but pisteo hois leges. I believe what you say. I believe the things you say. This is an interesting phenomenon. It's very common in Greek. We're only going to see it so much in the readings for related to this grammar presentation. Let's turn to some other pronouns. We have now been introduced to several pronouns in Greek: ego, se, hode, and the relative pronouns. So I, you, this, or he in some cases, and the relative pronouns now. Here are some other important pronouns. We've got ekeinos, ekene, ekeina, which can mean that or those, as in those ones over there, or even he, she, it. Usually we want to think of this as meaning that or those, as opposed to this or these, for instance. And we have allos, alle, alla, which we've actually seen before, and this means other or another. And we have autos, aute, auta, which can mean three different things, really. It can mean him, her, it. This can be basically the third person singular pronoun in non-nominative cases. It can also mean himself or herself or itself or ourselves or themselves. We'll look at that later. And it can also mean same, as in the same one, the same person, the same philosopher, etc. The same thing. These are all effectively 2-1-2 adjectives. Masculine declined as a second declension noun, feminine declined as a first declension noun, neuter declined as a second declension noun. But note how the neuter ends in a, omicron, rather than on, as usual. This is an exception to the normal second declension ending for the neuter. Now we're going to look at two of these in detail. Allas, alle, Allah. Used normally, allas means other or another. For instance, allas doa, other animals or other living things. Hai allai, the other women. These forms of allas, of course, agree in case, number, and gender. In this case, with the noun that it modifies. Here it's being used as an adjective, really. Zdoa, alla, zdoa, other animals. Here it's being used really as an adjectival noun, hai allai. It agrees feminine, plural, nominative. We're basically referring to the other women. We don't have the word women in there, but we can tell from the gender and the number that we're talking about women. We could also be referring to another plural feminine thing if it were clear from context what we were talking about. We also see it used something like this. Alas plasapas, alas poetes. So here, this is not being used as an adjective. It's being used as the subject, really as an adjectival noun on its own. And this is another verbal equation. Alas, another or one, equals philosophos. One is a philosopher. Another, we might say, a poet. In English, we would almost certainly vary our translation here. We wouldn't say another is a philosopher, another is a poet, or one is a philosopher, one is a poet. That is a possible translation, but the best translation is probably one is a philosopher, another is a poet. We also see this adjective in the following construction. We'll see this a couple times in the readings. Alloi alla legusin. Here we have our subject here, alloi. This is really our adjectival noun. Alla, our object, neuter plural accusative. Others literally say other things. Others say other things. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense literally. What it really means is something like some say this, others say that. It's a very compressed way of expressing this. We see it in both the plural as here and in the singular as well. It could be something like alas, Allah lege would mean one says this, another says that, or something like that. Let's look at autos, aute, auta. This is a little more involved. This important pronoun has several uses. When used by itself and not in the nominative, it usually means him, her, it, or them. This is again the third person pronoun, really, which we don't have any other form of. Pistel or auto. Auto is dative masculine singular. It's in the dative because the object of our verb pistel, I believe, I trust, takes the dative. This means I believe him. I believe him. It's used by itself, this form of autos, and it's not in the nominative. It's going to mean something like him, her, it, or them. When in the predicate position, it means myself, herself, itself, etc., themselves, ourselves, and is emphatic. See what this looks like. Ha poietes autos. Ha poietes autos. We know it's in the predicate position because it's outside of that definite article and noun combination. It would be in the attributive position if it were between them. But in this position, and especially in this case, in the nominative, it's always going to be like this, it's emphatic. You don't actually need this in order to express the basic meaning of the sentence. It's like, for instance, the poet speaks. We could leave out autos from that, and the basic meaning would be there. But if you wanted to say the poet himself speaks, as in it is the poet himself who speaks, we might use this form of autos in this position, in this case. The poet himself. When in the attributive position, it means same. So for instance, not ha poietes autos, but ha autos poietes. We have our form of autos in the attributive position between the definite article and the noun. So here's one of those places where paying careful attention to word order in Greek really is important. So this means the same poet, not the poet himself, but the same poet. And if we were just to say ha autos, that would be the same person, the same man. The implication will be clear. All right, yet another type of pronoun. When an object pronoun is the same as the subject of a sentence, we use a reflexive pronoun. We'll see this in English first. to give you a better sense. We don't say I know me. We don't say that. We say I know her. We don't say I know me. We say I know myself. Because here, our pronoun, our object pronoun, is the same as the subject of our verb. Myself, referring to the same person as is doing the action. So in Greek, we also have reflexive pronouns, and they are formed pretty simply, actually. In English, we form them with the form of the possessive adjective, my, your, his. It's actually it's himself, isn't it? Never mind. In Greek, reflexive pronouns are formed by adding a form of autos to the following. We're just going to look at singular forms right here. So first person singular, we're going to add our proper form of autos to this little prefix m, which we've actually seen in the different forms of ega. So for instance, emautu, this is genitive masculine singular. So if you were male, then you might use this word in reference to yourself. This means something like of myself. In the second person singular, we're going to start it with sigma, and we have here an optional epsilon as well. But we add to that sigma whichever form of autos that we need. So in this case, if we needed the singular feminine dative, we would have it be se aute or saute, which would mean something like to yourself, to yourself. And finally, third person singular, it's this he. So either he auton. We also have some contraction going on here. Instead of that he auton, we can just do hauton. This is easy to confuse with auton, but it's a rough breathing, hauton. And this would be the accusative singular masculine, of course. So it would mean something like himself in context. These are just examples. Obviously, these are not full declensions. The important thing to see is that we have taken one of these prefixes, basically, and added a form of autos to them. And if we want to say my of myself, or to myself, or with myself, we start with m. If you want to say to yourself, with yourself, for yourself, we would start with that sigma. And then if you want to say himself, to himself, for himself, etc., or herself or itself, we would start with that he. So what would the Greek equivalent of I know myself be? Well, the verb, of course, is gignosko, and it would be gignosko emauton. This verb would take a direct object, so we have the accusative, and since it's ourself that we know, since it's myself that I know, I start it with the first person singular, em auton. Em, my, auton, self. Finally, it's the last thing we'll look at today, the definite article as pronoun. Originally, the definite article, ha, he, ta, etc., was a pronoun meaning he, she, it, etc. So by originally, we mean like prior to most of the Greek that we're looking at. In Homer, we see uses of it like this. We also see the later uses in Homer as well. So it's even prior to Homer. This use is retained, however, even in Attic Greek, in constructions like the following. Ha men, ha de. So we're not going to see anything apart from men and de together with these forms of the definite article. They're going to stand in for pronouns. So ha men, ha de would be something like this one and that one. Men and de usually show some sort of contrast or parallelism, and we're not going to see any other word apart from the definite article here. Another example is ta men, ta de. This is really an idiom on the one hand, on the other. Really the ta is, it's referring to an it. It's like with reference to this thing on the one hand, and then with reference to this other thing on the other. It's really idiomatic in Greek, both of these. And then we have something like ta kai ta, literally it and it, or something like this. which means something like this and that, or such and such. Such and such might even be a better translation for this. So these are highly idiomatic constructions where the definite article is being used as a pronoun. Now, we've got lots of accidents that you'll want to take note of. We have 2 termination adjectives, the declension of autos, reflexive pronouns, ekeinos, the relative pronoun hos. And for further reading, you may want to take a look at relative clauses. In particular, I would take a look at relative clauses. And then autos and allos if the explanations here were not sufficient or you have little time on your hands. So thank you very much.